we're going to do a welcome. We're here today. We're going to do a seminar with Aidan Hollis, who's a professor of economics at the University of Calgary in Canada. He's the author of several papers on competition and innovation issues in the pharmaceutical industry. I first met Aidan, I think, in 2003 when we read a paper that he wrote about compulsory licensing and mandates for health insurance in a Canadian publication. And we invited him to give a talk on at the World Bank during conversations about access to medicine issues, particularly in developing countries. Aidan then has also worked as provided expert testimony in a competition case that I was involved in South Africa in 2003, involving TAC, the AIDS patient group in South Africa brought an excessive pricing case, and we were hired as the consultants to the Competition Commission at the time, and Aidan was one of several people that gave evidence in that case, which is that recently his testimony from that case was released by the Competition Commission. He has a long history of working on public health issues with a variety of cases. And I'd just like him to maybe, for a moment, talk a little bit about his background, and then he can introduce his own paper. Aidan?
Sure. Essentially, I'm an industrial economist, and I take that perspective. Sometimes I miss some other things, but anyway, hopefully I bring a perspective that's useful. So I've published on, as Jamie mentioned, a variety of things. Generic drug competition being one of them, ideas for pricing of generic drugs. I've been involved with the Health Impact Fund proposal since it started, and earlier than that, and in fact, I first heard about the delinkage idea from Jamie in conversations with him, I think in 2004. I've been working in that area and thinking about how to pay for drugs for developing countries, with a concern both for thinking about how do we get competition as well as how do we get innovation, and joining those two problems together. Okay, so I guess that's my introduction to myself. On the this topic, I've also been doing some work on orphan drugs, which have become an increasing problem almost everywhere. In fact, a lot of drugs are becoming orphan drugs because so many drugs are specialized. So I'm going to present a little bit of work which is joint with my student Kent Fellows. There's a paper in the Orphanet Journal of Rare Diseases in 2013, which summarizes what I'm going to present today. Oh, sorry, can you skip ahead? Okay, so one of the issues with orphan drugs is they've certainly become a really big business, and we're seeing that they're absorbing an increasing share of total insurer spending. And this isn't really because of volume, but it's because of extraordinary prices. So skipping forward. People really want to know how drugs are priced. I think it's a mystery, but how payers decide whether to accept a given price and pay for a drug is not a mystery. Usually the idea is that payers will evaluate the value of a drug in terms of the health benefits it confers. So typically they might use something like incremental quality adjusted life years or healthy year equivalents or something like that. And the standard kind of rule that's being applied by public insurers and to an increasing extent by private insurers is that they say, well, if the drug is cost effective, then they're willing to pay for it. And if the drug is not cost effective, that is, if it's above some cost per quality, then they question whether they should pay for it and often refuse. So with orphan drugs, you often see that the prices simply don't meet the value threshold. It's not surprising if you have a relatively small patient population, but the cost of drug development is similar. Companies are naturally going to want to make an argument that they have to charge a high price to make the drug a paying financial proposition. They can't invest otherwise. And that seems fair enough. Everyone can kind of understand that. The problem that this creates is that if you go down the road of saying, well, I have to have a high price because my costs per patient were high, if that's the argument that you are using, then you're intrinsically using a cost-based scheme of price regulation, where you say, based on high cost, I'm going to pay a given price. Notice that is totally different from a scheme in which price is based on value. So in this paper, what we do is to explore a little bit how it is that cost of service regulation works in other circumstances, and then to think about what you might learn from that experience. So in standard utility regulation, which has been used for a long time, the standard kind of approach has been to set some allowed rate of return to attract capital into an industry. And that might, for example, pay for you to be able to build a water distribution network. So the allowed prices for drugs whose high price is justified by high costs could be based on something similar. So that's the first point, is that if you're going to say, I want to have a high price because of high cost, then probably there should be an allowed rate of return. You don't want to have just an infinite rate of return. So we'll turn to that in just a sec. The second point is that a good regulatory practice historically has required an open framework with evidence tested and as kind of a special tribunal or court or some kind of government agency which is able to say something about what the costs are, to test it, and then to make judgments based on that. So going forward, suppose you were going to have cost-based pricing. Well, the first thing is probably you want to start by saying just because you have a small patient population, that doesn't imply that any price is okay. So we often see companies saying, well, this drug has a small patient population, so I should just be allowed to charge whatever I want. And that doesn't seem like it's reasonable. What would be reasonable? Well, probably the revenues that are allowed for the drug should reflect the ex-ante expected cost of development, including the adjustment for the risk of failure, the cost of capital, costs of production, distribution, etc. So you should allow the company to make a reasonable rate of return. And what does that mean? That the allowed revenues should be based on the average costs of drug development for orphan drugs plus the costs of production and distribution, etc. In this case, firms would have incentives to minimize their development costs, but they'd also have incentives to invest into the industry and into developing new drugs. So I think it's really useful just to stop and take an example of what this would actually mean. So suppose you start off with the, suppose the tribunal for orphan drug pricing had decided that the average new orphan drug development costs were on the order of $1 billion. So this is average costs, including the cost of failure, etc., the kind of costs that Professor DeMasi has estimated. So, and then suppose you were to apply it to a country, you'd say, well, maybe let's think about the UK as just an example. The UK's share of the rich countries' GDP is around 5%. So let's suppose that only the rich countries are going to pay anything towards new drug development. So their share for a new drug should be on the order of $50 million. And that means after, cost of capital, that maybe the firm should be earning something like $8 million per year over 10 years above the cost of production and distribution. So in pricing, you'd want to allow the firm to earn something like $8 million over their costs of production, distribution, and so on every year on that drug. Going forward a slide. So let's think about what this would imply. So suppose you had 600 patients who were going to receive that drug. Then you'd need to set a price that was high enough to cover how much? Well, around $13,000 per year, attributable R&D costs plus the cost of production and distribution. So I chose 600 because that's around how many patients were expected to get Ivacaftor, or what is the brand name as Kalydeco. That drug had around 600 patients in the UK, and the actual price per patient per year was on the order of $200,000. So what do we actually need to cover a reasonable rate of return? $13,000 plus the cost of production, distribution, whatever other costs you want to think about that have to do with providing a drug, regulatory costs, whatever. Suppose you had 200 patients, then in order to get $8 million per year from the UK, you'd need to charge an extra $40,000 per year just to pay for the attributable R&D costs. Again, recall that you need to have $40,000 plus the costs of production and distribution. So in the UK, Soliris, which is sold by Alexion, has around 200 patients, and the actual price per patient per year is somewhere in the range of $500,000. You can see straight away that this isn't exactly matching. Now, it could be, of course, that my cost per new orphan drug was all wrong. Maybe we should be using the current estimates of $2.5 billion per new chemical entity. Recall again, this includes the cost of capital and so on. So we're really, using the industry's estimates of what is a reasonable price here. In that case, the UK's share of cost should be around $20 million per drug per year over 10 years. And here you can see that the attributable R&D cost per patient per year, well, for Kalydeco it would be around $33,000, and for Soliris around $100,000 per patient per year. These are nowhere near the prices. What's happened? Well, Vertex is making a lot of money on Kalydeco, and Alexion is making a lot of money on Soliris. In fact, Alexion's CEO, according to Forbes in 2013 or 2014, I wasn't able to figure out from the article, made around $30 million in salary and total compensation. So someone's making lots of money out of this because the prices are far above the actual costs of developing the product, even when you include the cost of risk, the cost of capital, and so on. So why use this? I mean, clearly the companies aren't going to, but payers could. So payers could be thinking about what's a reasonable upper bound to pay. And so just jumping forward a slide, in the article there's a little model for how this could work. Suppose a company comes forward with a submission to an insurer. The insurer begins by asking, is it cost effective? Maybe does it meet this $50,000 per quality or $100,000 per quality standard? If the insurer says yes, then it should clearly insure the drug. Going over to the green side. if the insurer says, well, it's not really cost effective, and it's an orphan drug, it's got this small patient population, maybe we should consider, for equity reasons, at least they could then be asking the question, is the price justified by the cost? And if the price is not justified by the cost, then you really have to ask, should you be insuring the drug at that price? And maybe you need to have a rule that says we're not going to pay above fair costs to insure any drug. So I think the last slide, and then I'm looking forward to a conversation with you all. I think it's worth noting that when the total drug budget is more or less fixed, as it is in many places, then spending too much on one drug just reduces the amount that can be spent on others. It doesn't benefit the industry overall because it just shifts revenues from one company to another based on who's able to make the best case and who's able to use patient groups most effectively to drive politicians to insure one drug rather than another. And it harms patients because they end up getting access to fewer drugs because some drugs are vastly overpriced. So prices that far exceed the sum of production, distribution, and R&D costs are really not particularly good for patients or the industry. And it might be helpful for payers to have clear rules that say we just don't want to pay more than is justified by either the value of the drug in terms of its therapeutic impact, or in case we have small patient populations, more than the reasonable attributable costs of developing and producing the drug. If payers have clear rules, then it's going to help industry set appropriate prices. So thank you, and I look forward to a conversation about it.
Thank you. I thought that was very clear. I'd like to start by asking if any of the people that are remotely involved, sharing with or with us remotely, would like to ask questions. I think we have.
Yeah, just indicate in the group chat as we're discussing, and we'll make sure to get to you next, and we'll unmute you so you can join the discussion.
So the one that says me, that would be.
That's me.
Okay.
So,
So Ruth Lopert has the first question. Do you want to ask it yourself, Ruth?
Wait,
yeah.
Or she needs to unmute herself.
Ruth, you want to? Ruth says she can't unmute, but I'll just.
Yeah, click on that. Yeah, there we go.
There we go.
We can hear you now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was very interesting, and I apologise. I was stuck on another call and came in late, so I got the last bit. I was wondering if you'd mind going back to that slide with the diagram for a moment. Thank you. This is really, really interesting. But I'm wondering, in fact, whether this algorithm shouldn't be, in fact, reversed. I'm wondering if we should start with the question, is the price justified by the cost? And if the answer is no, then ask, well, is it still cost effective? Because I'd argue that there are quite a lot of drugs where if you applied this rationale that you've presented, they would come out as no, but then they might still be assessed as cost effective because of the downstream offsets and so forth. Because otherwise, if we just say, is it cost effective, and stop there if the answer is yes, then we're going to be paying prices that are actually excessive. And a good example I would think of that is Sovaldi, which a number of drug programs have assessed as cost effective, but I'm pretty sure that if you look at the cost-based pricing, the price would nowhere near be justified by the cost. Thank you.
So that's an interesting problem, and so I think I was trying to be a bit more modest here. The thing is that if we want to drive firms to invest in the products and the innovations which are going to create the most value, then starting off at least with the cost effectiveness standard is a reasonable way to encourage firms to do the things which are in fact going to deliver the most value to the population. So I'm comfortable with saying that Gilead should be richly rewarded for developing a product which is very effective and which is going to deliver enormous health gains. And by the way, I don't mean to suggest that the other products that I mentioned are not great products. They are. I think the thing is that they are, after all, not cost effective, and then also not justified by the price is not justified by the cost of drug development either.
Well, I think the jury is still out on Sovaldi because its outcome's only been assessed against a surrogate endpoint. But
okay, yeah. So let's suppose that it's cost effective as an assumption, and also very expensive. And it seems to be leading to a huge. I mean, it's leading to a huge payday for Gilead. That's for sure. Is that unreasonable? I'm not so sure.
Well, I think that's another issue. But I just worry that because our thresholds for assessing cost effectiveness are so woolly, that in fact that we're not paying over the odds for some things because we assert that they're cost effective, and that the price is not justified by the cost. And if the price were consistent with were justified by the cost, then we've not lost nothing by asking that question first, and we can then go on to say, well, no, it's not justified by cost-based pricing, but it might be justified on cost-effectiveness grounds, and then if it's still doesn't meet a yes, then we could say no, don't insure it, or apply pressure on the price.
This is Jamie Love.
There you go.
All right. This is Jamie Love. I think Ruth is raising a question of whether the model that Aidan is presenting today on orphan drugs is a correct model if you extend it to non-orphan products. And I think that's a really interesting and important and relevant question. I'd just like to come back to that, but first maybe discuss a little bit, like, to what extent do we think that the model that he's presented fits for orphan drugs first? But is that okay, Ruth? And we can sort of come back to this issue of how.
Yeah, I'm sorry, because yes, I was thinking beyond orphan drugs. I mean, for orphan drugs, I think it's entirely appropriate. My apologies if I muddied the waters there.
I have a few questions for Aidan on the thing, but I'd like to ask other people in the room here first, if they're attending in person, if they would like to ask any questions of Aidan on his presentation. We have some. Maybe we should introduce ourselves a little bit too. We have. You can start.
I'm off screen, but I'm Claire Cassidy. I'm with KEI.
Hi, I'm Zach. I'm with KEI.
Peter, public citizen.
Andy, KEI.
Dan Nugent, public citizen. Aidan Henry, public citizen.
Jamie Love, KI.
I'm Elizabeth. I'm with KEI.
And then on the video, we have a few extra people too, right? Yeah. I'm not sure who all's on here.
Yeah, Ruth, if you want to say your full name, because I realized we didn't.
Oh, sorry, Ruth Lopert, MSH and GW.
Okay, let me make sure. We'll go through. Before leaving.
Or you can just maybe mention who we've got, right?
We've got Nuria Midas. I apologize if I butcher anyone's name. Jing Lao. I'm sorry. And it says we've got an access intern from MSF, but I'm not sure who exactly that is.
All right. So then I'll start with a question about the orphan drug. Because part of your model, as I understand, Aidan, is that you start out with the am I muted now?
No, you're not. Go ahead.
Aidan, my understanding is that as part of your pricing model presented in your paper, you have this average cost of the development of an orphan drug. And you made reference in your talk to a couple of different estimates that Joe Damasi has made, which are based upon not just orphan drugs, but all drug development. In fact, in some cases, he really dismisses the idea that orphan drugs are that important, or that they would be, I mean, he sort of questions whether or not the data that we've looked at in terms of orphan drugs is really relevant, or impeaches his data. So I'm not sure how relevant his own samples are to the drugs we're talking about. I think Lizzie's done some work on the size of patients in clinical trials, and I think that her data shows that the number of patients, at least mentioned in the medical review for orphan drugs, are really small relative to non-orphan drugs, maybe roughly a fifth or something like that. And so they have smaller patient trials. The other thing is that they tend to have, because the orphan drugs have a simpler approval process. I think it's easier to get a drug approved as an orphan indication than it is for a larger indication. I think they often have shorter time to the market. And they have this tax credit in the United States which compensates them for 50% of the cost of the clinical trials that qualify for the orphan drug tax credit for that indication. So what type of data, I guess what I'd be asking Aidan is, what kind of data would you want to have on orphan drug average cost development? What sort of information would you want to have in order to set the base for what you think the average cost might be for drug development for orphan drugs as opposed to drugs in general?
That's a good question. In fact, drugs in general are becoming more and more orphan drugs. Right? There are fewer drugs that don't qualify. In fact, if I'm not, I may be mistaken, but I did read that Sovaldi actually was categorized as an orphan drug.
No, it wasn't. I don't think.
Okay.
I think we can give you some data.
I'm familiar with all those credits, and I'm familiar with basically the claims from sort of financial people who say, one of the reasons that orphan drug development has become attractive is because it is in fact relatively low cost to develop some of these drugs. It's also true that for many of these drugs there are substantial contributions from other parties, including, of course, from whatever, governments, charitable organizations, the like. Kaleido, all the initial research work and part of the phase 1 trials are actually paid for by the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. So yeah, it's true that there's all kinds of issues with the cost. So what kind of information would you want to have? I guess you'd want to do the same kinds of things that Damasi has done, using essentially a set of drugs that were classified as orphans, and then you'd want to take into account some of those other cost deductions.
Let me just give you some data points from the paper that Lizzie's working on. It confirms part of what you said, which is that more and more drugs are classified this way. She has, over the period of 2010 to 2014, that 35% of the FDA approvals for new chemical entities and new molecular entities were classified as orphans when they were approved. But it was 29% in 2010, and in 2014 it was 43%. So it was really a big number in the most recent year. But that's still a big number. It's like overall over the 5-year period it was more than a third, and it was almost half in the last year. So I think you're right about that. In terms of the size of the trials, just to give you some data points on that, for the orphans themselves, for the drugs in general, the average for the products were around almost 4,000. It was 3,888 number of patients in the trials in the medical review. For orphan drugs, the number was 1,219, so it was a lot smaller. So just so that, but you already did mention that the people you you've been reading people from the industry talk about the fact that orphan drugs are cheaper to develop. So that would actually suggest that the numbers are even worse than presented in your paper. Is that correct?
It could, yeah. I mean, I tried to use just the conservative numbers because even when you use the industry's own very large, sort of 2.5 billion number, you can see that pricing doesn't seem to reflect a reasonable rate of return.
Okay, so I want to ask anybody from Public Citizen have any questions for Aidan? Any reactions to his paper?
Well, I guess one thing was that you use the UK, and I wonder if you use the US as the baseline. Like in terms of the OECD spending, I'm sure the US is a much, much larger proportion. And so how do those prices compare with like the current prices that you were discussing?
So I just used a share of GDP to set what people should be paying.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be more or less similar, across countries, because U.S. GDP per capita is not that much higher than UK.
So I guess because he didn't look at the incidence of the patients per country, but more the GDP, to the extent that you would just kind of scale these numbers by country according to the GDP relative to the UK to get higher or lower, right?
Yeah, I think it would be appropriate to think about per capita GDP as setting a reasonable standard for what countries should be paying.
And so what's interesting is that the numbers should come out for orphan drugs. It's interesting if you look at the cost numbers. For some products, it's like 13,000 or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
For the R&D component, right?
Right. Per capita, per person, per patient per year.
Yeah, and if you were to run those numbers up for a drug that had a large client population, getting back to Ruth's point, like a drug like Sofolthi or something like that, that number would really shrink from 13,000, right?
A lot.
Yeah. So what he's done is what Aidan's done is he's taken like a cost-based model and taken the drugs that have come out the most expensive you can imagine by taking the smallest client population. And if you go the other direction, if you take drugs for heart disease or asthma or things like that have large populations, those numbers just fall through the floor, right?
Yeah, of course.
So that does suggest that if you do cost-based pricing, and getting back to Ruth's point, if you apply it across the board, that you really have a different perspective.
Yeah, I mean, partly this is driven by just thinking about what are the arguments that the companies themselves are making.
That's right.
Right. So if the company says, "I need a higher price because I have a small patient population and my costs are still high, so you have to give me more." Okay, it's because of your costs then. So you're justifying it on costs. Okay, here's a cost-based price. And if you can step forward and say, I just want to charge a high price, it has nothing to do with the size of the population. I want to charge you $500,000 per year because this is a great drug and has nothing else to do with costs. Okay.
Ruth has a question.
Couple of questions. First of all, when you're looking at GDP, is that PPP adjusted or just straight?
Oh, I think it's just straight.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. There's probably an argument to think about PPP adjusted. I hadn't thought about it.
I would just on that particular point, because it comes up a lot, because we've always felt that PPP adjustments make sense for some things, but not for paying for drugs, which are you have to pay with hard currency. And so we think that the you picked the right number, nominal GDP.
No, I just thought it was worth thinking about. That was all. It was a minor point. I was just thinking about going back to this issue of the order of those questions and the cost effectiveness. The important thing about not paying too much is not displacing therapies of higher value, I would argue, by paying too much. And I don't know if you've been following Carl Claxton's recent work on looking at thresholds in the UK, suggesting that a more appropriate threshold for the value of a QALY in the UK is maybe as low as £13,000. and yet NICE is using a threshold of between £20,000 and £30,000 per collie, suggesting that every decision that NICE makes to approve something as cost effective and then by doing so mandate its uptake within NHS may in fact be displacing higher value therapies. And that's another reason for me, from my perspective, to reverse the order of the assessment. Sorry, I don't want to belabor the point, but it's just what was going through my mind as you were saying that.
I'd like to ask Aidan if he could walk people through a bit how you, because the paper presents it a bit, and it, but if you have, on the one hand, you have $1 billion that you've taken as your base for the average cost of orphan drug development, and then you have a per capita income of a country like the UK. How is it you come up with the $13,000 or the $40,000, depending on the size of the population? It's sort of what assumptions, if you could explain to people here, what assumptions you make in terms of the period of exclusivity, or just so people understand what you did to get there.
Sure. So if we could go back to that the first slide that walks through that for the example for the UK. A bit further. You were on it. There you go. So if you had capital costs of $1 billion, and then you took a country which had 5% of OECD GDP, the idea being that then the UK should be paying its fair share, if you like, of the capital costs when it's purchasing the drug. So 5% of $1 billion is 50 million. And then that 50 million has to be allocated over several years. So in the paper is a bit more sophisticated about this. But let's suppose that you were imagining that the product was going to have 10 years of exclusivity, and then you have some kind of discounting going on. Maybe you're, depending on the discount rate, you could be looking at $6, $7, $8 million per year is what the company needs to earn over the 10 years in order to recoup its $50 million. So it needs to get $8 million a year over its other costs of production distribution. So again, the next slide. So then you just divide that by the patients. So it's pretty straightforward to get from there to a certain amount for any product as being a reasonable amount that would be an appropriate attribution towards the firm's development costs for the product.
Just so I can just sort of so you take the country's allocated share, like in this case $50 million, and you say that because they're not going to get it all in the first year, because it's going to take 10 years to get it, that you give them a total of 80 million, because then the 80 million would have a present value of 50 million once you look at the discount rate over that 10 year.
I mean, yeah, whatever the appropriate discount rate is here, and here I've chosen a generous one.
And so they get 80 million to pay for their cost in year one of 50 million, and that the other part is just grade school arithmetic, right? You divide it by the number of patients that they're treating under the product. And I guess for a lot of orphan drugs, I guess one thing we've noticed is that the number of patients that qualify for the orphan drug tend to grow over time. Often they come on with a single indication, and then if you look down the road 3, 4, 5, 7 years out, often the client population has grown because they've marketed the drug, they've developed better diagnostics, they've expanded the label and that sort of thing.
Right, and that's happened with these two drugs for Kalydeco and Soliris.
Nuria has a question too, so let me unmute her if you'd like to ask it yourself. Go ahead, you're unmuted.
I was just asking if you would use the same method if the product was produced and developed by a public laboratory or pharmaceutical company.
Yeah, an example of that would be how would you reflect the subsidies from the orphan drug tax credit, or, and as she mentioned, in a case where the product was completely developed in a public entity.
So I suppose if a public entity came forward and said, I want to charge you a massively high price in order to cover my costs, then I would tend to look at the whether the product was valuable, you know, in terms of its cost effectiveness, and then if it didn't, I think it'd be reasonable to say, yeah, we don't need to pay you such a high price. Let's pay you an appropriate amount of money. Now that's assuming that this public entity had chosen to price in that way. I mean, I think actually the case of Kaleido is kind of interesting because the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation Therapeutics, which is the sort of an arm of the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, got an 8% royalty on because of its contribution to the research component and also part of the clinical costs of developing that product and others. So they got an over $3 billion payday by selling off their royalties to another, I guess, a royalty firm. Essentially, the foundation earned just a huge amount of money, which, of course, they're now plowing into more cystic fibrosis research. And this, basically, all of this money is coming from charging really, really high prices.
Did you want to follow up on that?
I was only raising this issue because it really bothers me that those who have rare diseases are kind of left out of the health systems if we use this sort of approach. And when we talk about insurance, there is always cross subsidies, right, from the healthy to those that are not so healthy. So I tend to think that in pharmaceuticals, something like that could be also worked out.
I have, Aidan, if you want to answer her, that's fine. I had a little different question. That is that.
So, okay, then I guess I could just, so I'm not quite sure whether you were saying that this kind of scheme would reduce incentives for orphan drug development, or not. I didn't understand that.
My underlying problem is not as much the incentives. I don't work on pricing, but I look at health systems and pharmaceutical policies more from the human rights perspectives. And it bothers me that we end up leaving people with orphan diseases out of the health systems because they become so expensive.
Are you talking about in the United States or in developing countries, or what's their context? Because they're not really left out of the U.S. system, or the Canadian, or the UK system.
I am talking basically in general. If we take an approach where only certain drugs that cost below a threshold would be covered by either insurance companies or the public purse.
So you
I think, and this is in part a response to that. So certainly some economists have made an argument to say, look, we should just stick with cost effectiveness, and there is no, there's no good reason to pay for orphan drugs when the prices are so high, and basically it doesn't meet the cost effectiveness threshold. And then what I observed was that regardless of that argument, many insurers were, including in the UK or in Canada, were still saying, well, we do have this threshold, but these drugs don't meet it, but we're going to make an exception because they're orphan drugs. And then all of a sudden they have no rule, and they don't know how much to pay. So this says, in those circumstances, if you're lacking a rule because you want to pay for a drug, at least don't pay for more than the a sort of reasonable rate of return on the expected costs of drug development.
Okay, thanks.
And I have a question, and that relates to the role of the public subsidies. If the United States paid for half the cost of the clinical trials on drug development and maybe part of the preclinical research through the NIH research or something like that, and then Canada or the UK was facing a price, to what extent should Canada or the UK take into account a subsidy for the drug developer that was paid in the United States but not in their country?
That's a good question. I mean, it does suggest that you need a little bit better coordination of these things, but so quick answer is I'm not quite sure how payers should think about subsidies which are variable between drugs. Certainly in the U.S., you would have thought that payers should be thinking about those subsidies when they're assessing what the average cost of drug development is.
In 2014, there were 10 cancer drugs approved in the United States. 9 of them were classified as orphan drugs, and those 9 qualified for the orphan drug tax credit. So it's a significant issue that hasn't really been discussed much in terms of the drug development costs. It's just this role of the orphan drug tax credit in terms of the actual cost of developing drugs.
Yeah, I think I'm not. Well, one reason why I didn't worry about that too much here is that the orphan drug tax credits, while it is certainly helpful, and while government support of all the basic research that makes all of these things possible is also really important. When you think about the total cost of drug development, it's still substantial. So if you were to look at, for example, the cost of the bench work, which is going to bring the drug forward, and you said that's roughly half the cost, and then the clinical trials are maybe roughly half the cost, but then you can get a subsidy for essentially a large proportion of that. That is still only going to be at the very most something like 25% of the total cost of drug development. So, I mean, it's significant, but it's not overwhelming.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the
So, let's suppose you basically get a tax credit which is worth 50% of the cost of drug development, and or at least of the clinical trial cost, and the clinical trials themselves are approximately 50% of the risk-adjusted total costs. Then that subsidy is only 25% of the total drug development costs.
Yeah, I have to go check it. See how Tomasi works this out. But because he uses a very high cost of capital, it's true that he kind of ramps up the preclinical. But his preclinical stuff he starts with the idea that the out-of-pocket preclinical share is in the 30s, 30%, not 50%. But I guess after he applies this aggressive cost of capital numbers, he begins to get close to 50%. So I guess that's right. But also, I think that the issue of the government subsidies apply both to preclinical as well as the clinical for a lot of products. Certainly.
Right. The orphan drug tax credit specifically doesn't.
That's correct. The orphan drug tax credit is exactly like the way you described it. And then the other things the governments fund in terms of basic research are harder to kind of attribute to specific drugs.
I mean, I think it's fair to observe that there are continuing, substantial continuing costs of drug development. Often there are phase 4 requirements. There's all kinds of compliance requirements, and basically it's a big, expensive enterprise. So I don't want to, downplay what it costs to bring a new drug forward. It's often very expensive. It's valuable and important. So that's why I've basically used really kind of generous numbers. But to me, the issue is even when you use the big generous number of $2.5 billion, and you ignore all of those subsidies, and you just say, okay, well, let's suppose orphan drugs cost as much to develop as the most expensive estimates that we have out there. The prices just don't reflect those costs at all.
Yeah, certainly not.
It doesn't really matter when you look at the numbers. If you said, well, the share of cost should be $5,000 instead of $13,000, and the company's charging $200,000, right? That's only $8,000. It's trivial. It's so far out.
Okay, I had a question based off of using the GDP. How would your suggestion or model change based off of orphan diseases that were disproportionately in either high GDP countries or low GDP countries?
So I mean, with some orphan drugs, there are actually unusual sort of distributions of need, and cystic fibrosis is certainly such a case. So the roughly 70,000 cystic fibrosis patients are not evenly distributed around the world by any means. So I guess you can imagine circumstances where you'd say, okay, well, we should think about the total patient burden and adjust it by GDP or something. I mean, you could weight by GDP and think about what the relevant patient population was in OECD countries.
Yeah. So one of the issues you look at is, I guess is for some products you'd want to have more. I'm just saying that what Aidan sort of seemed to be saying is that you presented kind of a general approach that people might want to fine tune and move in that direction, but you tried to show them just as an initial first cut at it that it's a significant disparity between what you come up with in this model and what you observe in the market.
Right. I mean, one other thing that's actually worth noting is that many of these orphan drugs are never going to have real generic competition or anything like it. So there just is not a large enough market. So the 10-year exclusivity period is in fact too short. Really, they're probably likely to have exclusivity much longer than that.
I just want to come back to one of the main points that Aidan said, and that is that the whole argument to avoid cost effectiveness rules, which cap prices at a certain amount in some systems for orphan drugs, is the argument he mentioned that it isn't generous enough because they have a small client population and implicitly cannot make enough money with a small number of patients in order to recover their R&D cost. And so, as he says, they're the ones that basically are using implicitly, sometimes explicitly, the idea that the R&D costs are high relative to the revenues from the patients, and he just wants to test how that works out, doing arithmetic, right? This is not rocket science, right? In terms of the math, I mean.
Yeah, no, there's a reason why. I mean, basically, these like the payout to the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation at $3.3 billion was on the basis of selling the royalties, an 8% royalty to Kaleido, plus for one other drug that was in phase 3 and has now been approved. But at the time when the royalties were sold, it was in phase 3, and another drug which was in phase 1 or 2. That was, so most of the money basically related to Kaleido.
Ruth, you're
That was
unmuted.
an 8% royalty. So that's right off the top, and that's telling you that basically that drug was generating such high profits, right? It's a small molecule, it's not expensive to produce. And, because of that, basically, Vertex's market cap was on the order of $30 billion. So, why is the market cap so high? It's because they're going to make profits on those products over time. Why are they going to make profits?
Did you want to comment? Ruth?
No, it was just responding to something Jamie said. We've moved on. It's okay.
Okay.
Well, we're right about at almost, we're at 58 minutes into this video, so I was just wondering, we'd like to wind it up, but I'd like to thank Aidan for making what I thought was a really interesting and persuasive and clear presentation, and ask anyone else if they had any final comments to make, including and ask Aidan if he wanted himself, after other people make comments, to say anything before we conclude the video. Is there anyone that would like to say anything to Aidan or to anyone else before we get to Aidan? No? Okay, Aidan, is there anything you'd like to say?
Well, just thanks for making it possible, and just if you're interested in sort of a little bit more thinking about this, you'll find the article, which is the title of the presentation, is available. It's open access on Orphanet.
Yeah, and the article was sent out to everyone who RSVP'd to the event, and we will also put it on the YouTube bio for future viewers.
Great.
Thank you, Aidan. Thank you very much.
Great. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Thank you.